My name is Martin Jackson. I'm a distinguished engineer at Walmart, a retailer that you may have heard of. This is expanding the circle of trust, onboarding new Puppet developers. We've been at this DevOps journey for a while now. And as you can see here, we've gotten to talk a lot about some of the things that we've done as Walmart with Puppet and with other DevOps practices. These are screen caps from some of the previous talks that I've done. And it's exciting to see all of you again. I've seen a bunch of you at previous Puppet events. I've met a bunch of you for the first time this year. And it's really exciting to see everyone here. We have a number of people from our Walmart Puppet team, from our own circle of trust here, a couple of our core team members, and a couple of our contributors. And so that's really exciting. Of our Walmart contingent, I believe at least 4 of the 5 that are here, this is their first PuppetConf or Puppetize event, which is really exciting too. So we're on this DevOps journey, and we're working really hard at empowerment. For us at Walmart, Puppet is all about making and keeping infrastructure promises. And it's a tool and a mechanism for us that we use to be able to make large-scale promises for things that people can depend on. And that dependence builds confidence, and that confidence is trust. And that's why we call it a circle of trust. This is the current shape of our deployment. We are currently managing just north of 100,000 nodes in a single console. That's split about 60-40 between Linux nodes and Windows nodes. And these nodes are spread all across our estate. They are in our data centers, in our co-locations, in our stores, in our distribution centers, all around the world. That represents 107 million individual resources that are being managed across the fleet, averaging almost 1,000 resources per node. So when we talk about doing this stuff at scale, this is a pretty substantial scale. What this talk is really all about, though, is more about how our developers interact with the system and how we think about and categorize and culturally how we sort of assimilate and grow our developer community. So the stuff in green is really the important thing on this slide. These numbers were captured just after Labor Day this year. And so in the 90 days previous to Labor Day, we merged into our production Puppet environments 985 individual commits. Not PRs, commits. That's important. We don't rebase. So, you know, it's not 985 PRs, but 985 commits, averaging 16 commits per working day. We are deploying to production all the time, every day. We've deployed 3 or 4 changes to production today, while a good chunk of the core team is here at Puppetize. And that's something that we're really, really proud of. So this is the way that we visualize our circle of trust. We have what we call kind of a Puppet core team. And the responsibility of the Puppet core team is not really to write Puppet code to automate the environment. The job of the Puppet core team is to enable other people who are domain experts for their compute areas, for their middleware areas, or for whatever their core area of subject expertise is, to be able to use the Puppet tooling to be able to make and keep large-scale promises across the Walmart environment. We value and work very hard at growing a large community of contributors. And those contributors contribute to our Puppet code base and our Puppet data elements in whatever way suits them. We provide the tooling, and they apply their subject matter expertise and their understanding of the business processes and so forth to build the right automation processes that guarantee and enforce and maintain standards across our entire fleet. Also, an important part of what we consider our circle of trust is the larger Walmart community that may not even be directly aware of the fact that we're using Puppet. We have business users, we have higher level application developers for whom configuration management, policy management, all the standards that we enforce are simply implementation details. But they most certainly depend on all of those things being consistent. And so they trust that consistency and they depend on that consistency as well. Also, a very important component of our circle of trust is all of the rest of you as the Puppet community. We work to contribute back to Puppet modules. We participate in the Puppet community because together, all of us are stronger and we all benefit in some way from each other's work. And that's important to us too. So why do we focus on growing this circle of trust, especially at the contributor level? We believe that we achieve three primary gains. We achieve more speed. The more people who are qualified and competent to develop against your code base, the faster you can go. We believe that we gain also in terms of agility. With a very small Puppet team and a very small base of contributors, it's very easy to get into a situation where you're single-threaded. And when we were earlier in our journey, we only had 1 or 2 qualified Puppet developers per team that needed to use Puppet. And so everything had to block on the Puppet person. And so now we have, potentially multiple people on every team that needs to use Puppet, who's fluent in Puppet, comfortable using Puppet to be able to solve problems. And that gives us a lot more agility because when priorities interrupt different workflows, or someone's on vacation or sick or something, work can continue. And that agility is important. And as we increase in both speed and agility, and as more and more solutions are delivered through the tooling, that builds organizational confidence. One of the things that a lot of people are really worried about, and one of the things that we worried about a lot more towards the beginning of our journey, not to say that we are anywhere near the end of it, we still have a lot to learn. But one of the things we worried an awful lot about at the beginning was, if there is a single large-scale problem, what's going to happen? Are they going to pull the plug? Is everything going to come to a screeching halt? Are they going to make us unwind all the work that we've done? That's a big fear. Building small incremental benefit and small incremental changes is a great way to build that confidence over time. And so when there are hiccups, and there will be hiccups, when there are hiccups, people can look back on that history of successful changes, and it doesn't have to be the kind of a proverbial apocalypse. Now, looking at some of our more developer-oriented statistics, these are some numbers that we are also extraordinarily proud of. And this shows just how far we've come in terms of building our circle of trust. Internally, our primary control repository is the main mechanism by which people make contributions to our code base. And so we track the number of forks of our control repository. There are currently 88 of them, which means that at least 88 people within the Walmart organization have attempted or desired to make a change to our Puppet code base. Okay, a lot of forks lie around dead. How live is that number? And looking over the 30 days previous to Labor Day, we had 26 individual contributors who proposed and merged a change into our control repository. We also have 61 forks of our Huayra Data repo, which is important because we have a number of contributors, and we consider them contributors as well, and a very important part of our circle of trust, who will only propose changes to the configuration data. They don't necessarily need to interact by making new code changes. They only need to update data values that exist. And you may think, I've spoken in a lot of these different events. I consider myself a very technical person. I've written a fair amount of Puppet code. You may wonder where I sit on the overall leaderboard at Walmart. And the answer, I looked this up, and it was just for the purpose of this talk. One of the security team members passed me for 15th on our all-time leaderboard for contributions just before I pulled these numbers, and I'm extremely proud of that. Very, very excited about that. Thank you. It means we have a large, vibrant, and active community. And it's not single-threaded through me. That's the important thing. What is the connection between a railway and the space shuttle? Probably not a question that you thought you would be asked to consider this morning. One of the big cultural aspects of how we go about making large-scale change is the question of how we frame and how we think about that change. I'm sure that the whole bunch of you did not come to Portland expecting to hear, change is hard. Everybody knows that change is hard. People don't like to change. Also, fairly obvious. You don't need to come to a conference to hear that. The question is, how do we couch significant transformative change in such a way that makes it easier for people to digest and adopt it? And this is where we come up with the connection between the railway system and the space shuttle. Humanity did not consider that it would be possible to fly into space in the middle of the 19th century when we built the railway system. It took a long time and a lot of infrastructure that got built up incrementally, unit by unit over time, to be able to make it possible to fly into orbit. And the solid rocket boosters that are part of the space shuttle launch systems were actually manufactured in Utah because Utah is a lot drier, because that makes for better packing of solid rocket fuel, a bunch of those things. And so one of the major constraints of the solid rocket booster system, because those things had to be manufactured in Utah and then shipped to Florida to be assembled for the launch vehicle, they had to fit on the railway system. Society as a whole trusted the railway system, and so the change that enabled us to fly into space and recover a vehicle flying into space depended on the advances that had been made previously over the previous century, because everybody understood and trusted how the railway system worked. Change is made incrementally in small steps over time. And in the same way, Puppet has been successful in our environment because for 20 years previous to our adoption of Puppet at Walmart, we had been making small incremental improvements and changes to the way that we do automation. We had our own internally built orchestration tool, which if you squinted at it in the right way and looked at it in just the right kind of lighting, might look like an eventual consistency configuration management system. Now that's certainly overselling it, but as we talked about that, we were able to draw the connections between how that system worked and how Puppet worked. And we were able to map the notion of Puppet environments and the way that we do incremental rollouts to the way that we do Puppet deployments. And that was also a key thing that enabled us to be able to push forward with our environment running in all enforcing mode all the time. Those 107,000 plus nodes that we're running are all running in enforcing mode for every Puppet run. If we ever find one in no-op mode, that's a bug and we go hunt it down and kill it. Truth. So we've learned 3 key lessons, and there are 3 key things that we want to share with all of you as a result of going through these processes. First, when it comes to making large-scale transformative change, build a coalition of the willing. There are always going to be a lot of people who struggle against, resist, and fight change. There are always going to be even more people who are going to want to ride the fence and see how it all turns out. But there's always going to be a small core of people for whom living with the status quo is more painful and more undesirable than whatever they have to go through to implement the change. Find those people. Get those people together in the same place. Empower those people to be able to make the change that they're hoping to do. This is exactly what Walmart's approach was when we first started down this configuration management and automation journey. And as we were able to eke out these individual small successes, we eventually were able to assemble a lot of those small wins into much larger organizational victories. And we've been able to go from managing a few nodes to managing thousands of nodes to managing over 100,000 nodes now. So building that coalition of the willing is an important first step. The next thing is maintaining the right mindset. This is a term that we use on the Puppet Core team regularly. Ride the lightning, reap the whirlwind. You may recognize that as a quote from StarCraft 2. It is. Yeah, we're all gamers. What we mean by that is that there is a twofold responsibility. We have to continue to push the edge of the envelope in terms of what features are available, because features that are available bring value to somebody. They bring value to you, they bring value to your users. There is another responsibility that we have to maintain the safety, the integrity, and the continuance of all the business processes that we support. So it's easy to pose it as an either-or question. Either we change or we're stable. Either we change or we're stable. What ride the lightning, reap the whirlwind means to us is that we do not make a decision between those things. We have to do them both at the same time, all the time. And so as a practical example, we are on the short-term support edition of Puppet Enterprise. They release it, we run it. We've run almost every release of Puppet Enterprise since 2015.2. I think we've only missed one in the last 3 years. And so it's our responsibility as the core team for Puppet to bring those new features to our users. It's more important to us to be able to bring those features and to smooth out any of the difficulties that may exist between the short-term version and the long-term version than it is to kind of play it safe and run the long-term support version because it's stable. I understand there are a lot of groups that run the long-term support version, and there's nothing, there's no judgment for running the long-term support version. We're pretty well staffed, and we've put a lot of effort into making sure that the upgrade process works for us. But that's what ride the lightning, reap the whirlwind means for us. As we are aggressively making change and keeping the environment around us stable, one of the other things to keep in mind is that as you are considering whether or not you add new features, whether or not you accept requests from people to do something, remember this: no is temporary, yes is forever. When you say yes to the wrong thing, you introduce a long-term support obligation. And that's not to say that no is the right answer in many cases. In many cases, no is the wrong answer. But bear in mind that when you do say yes to something, that yes will create a long-term obligation, and that has consequences that will go through time. We categorize the contributors to our Puppet code base in approximately 4 categories. And we don't differentiate very much between these things. We see a lot of overlap. We're very, very careful not to present this as a hierarchy. One class of contributors is not higher than another class of contributors. One class of contributors is not better than another class of contributors or more desirable. We present the tooling, and people consume the tooling in a way that is appropriate for them to be able to gain value from it. We have a large number of users who only ever need to interact with our Huayra Data workflow because they may have service account passwords that they need to change every 60 days. They don't need to change code. They gain value from Puppet that way, and that's great. Maybe someday they will have a problem that requires them to interact with the system in another way. So we make it easy for them to move into another category of contribution. They can make Puppet code changes. And this is probably the largest category of contributors that we have. Changing the sets of resources that we manage, changing the policies, adding support for new operating systems as they come online, removing support from operating systems as they come online, adding new resources to meet new business requirements, those kinds of things. Sometimes people have extraordinarily complicated use cases, and that will lead them to writing their own custom facts and their own defined types. The concept of defined types is a fairly advanced thing, and it's a very powerful thing that Puppet has. There are some users that we have that have to fill in gaps in rare cases where Forge modules don't cover all the needs, or where we've got some legacy stuff that there's not another easy way to deal with. Everybody's got some of that. So we provide mechanisms for people to write their own defined types and facts, and we work with them and teach them how to do those things. And there are also new Forge modules that are being released all the time. I see a couple of people here from Vox Populi. We are heavy users of a number of the Vox Populi modules. We prefer to use Forge modules whenever possible to drive our low-level technologies, because why reinvent the wheel? In many cases, those modules cover all the use cases that we need, as well as many more. And so in the process of doing all these things, we keep three principles in mind. Objectivity is key. Every deployment artifact has a Git reference that's associated with it. Everything that happens in the system creates an artifact that is outside of human interpretation and outside of, well, I think it's this, you think it's that, we can just agree to disagree. The objectivity is, these are the resources, this is the artifact, this is what it is. And we publicize that. And the second principle that is key for us is visibility. We provide visibility into all of those artifacts to as many people as we possibly can. We provide read-only access to our console to everyone that we possibly can, from the first level, low-level help desk people who answer phone calls, all the way to our design engineers. And anyone from security, DBA, any of the engineering teams, applications teams, if they want access to our console, they get access to our console. And we also use opinionated workflows. What we mean by opinionated workflows is there are places where you have free choice in terms of how you use Git or what technology stack that you implement. We require that people follow a very particular Git workflow to push Huayra Data changes through our system, and a very particular workflow to push module changes through our system. That makes things easier for us because it's one workflow to teach. It makes things easier for the organization because it ensures operational consistency with how things work. And it makes it easier for our users because our users, in many cases, have never been exposed to Git workflows before. And in truth, we probably spend more of our time on the Puppet core team teaching people how to use Git than some of the technological details of how to use Puppet. And you can see my team members here are nodding vigorously. That's what we do. And that's what I've heard from a lot of other large Puppet users as well. And so the pillars of what we consider important to us to do on the core team, skills development is the most important thing. We are here to make our users successful. We are here to provide a tool set that our users can use to get their work done, to, as Yvonne says, eliminate that soul-crushing work. That's really important to us. And whatever skills development people need, we're here to provide it. We'll teach Git. We will consult on difficult modules. We won't be responsible for those modules. We won't be the author of those modules, but we will absolutely provide guidance, support, and help in getting that code written. We lead with the mindset. We have to model this notion that we cannot choose between speed, agility, and stability. There's a technical term that biologists use for stability. death. In biology, if something is stable, it is dead. And that is something that we like to remind people of as well. We provide accountability through the visibility and objectivity tools that we provide. Every single artifact that is deployed has a user ID associated with it, a commit, a timestamp, a person who proposed the change, and a person who actually merged the change. And sometimes when bad things happen, those are the first people that get talked to. Bad things don't happen often, but they do happen. So the net results of all of these things are that we've seen a dramatic decrease in the mean time that it takes to solve a problem. As the knowledge of how to use this tooling percolates through the environment, as more and more people get comfortable using the tooling, and as more and more people see successful solutions be deployed with the tooling, it takes less and less time to solve the problem because there's a network effect. More people become familiar with the tooling, and on the core team, we don't have to spend as much of our time giving low-level advice. We have a very active Slack channel where other users in our community will happily give people advice on how to do things. We'll give people pointers to example code for particular solutions. And we love that. That's really exciting. As the time to solve problems goes down, the size of problems that you are comfortable solving with the tooling goes way, way up. We have done some things in the last year or two with our tooling that have been largely driven by business requirements, but that we could not have imagined contemplating 5 or 6 years ago. We've done deployments of chain-wide of network login access. Could not have envisioned doing that 5 years ago. Changing authentication authorization stack on a live running Linux server, that's a big deal. It really is. You screw that up, you're examining your backup policy. But we've done that. We've made a bunch of changes to our allowed ciphers and SSH. That's also a big scary thing. But it's an important thing from a security standpoint because security compliance and using good ciphers is a good part of good security hygiene. These are promises that we can now make because we've grown our circle of trust. And so we like to think about all of these different people that are participating with us as a large community. As the core team, we are not responsible for these successes. We've helped people get done the things that they needed to get done. We've provided them tooling to be able to make promises and keep those promises. And we are incredibly excited and happy and thrilled to be part of that community with you. I should add one more thing. We're hiring. We have a senior systems engineer position open. If you look at my LinkedIn profile, the job requisition is listed there. If you want to DM me or any of the other Walmart people here about it, we'll be happy to discuss it with you. Thank you all very much. This is my contact information, martinjackson@walmart.com. And legal said I could put the disclaimer at the end this year. Thank you. Yeah.
You want to take questions?
If people want to stick around and ask a couple, sure. Yes. How many services? We don't really count by service. We keep the fence posts pretty clear that we do a very little bit of middleware, but most of what we do is core operating system stuff. And so from a service standpoint, the number would be relatively small, but the number of critical security keys and authorization, authentication elements, kernel tunings, things like quotas and U limits and things like that, that's primarily what we do. We don't really have a services managed metric. Yes? Sorry.
I noticed you had Huayra Data as a separate repository.
Yes.
Which I think is pretty good, because otherwise I think it's part of the control repo, the whole thing gets deployed. So separating the Huayra Data. I'm curious, for the people you're giving access to make changes in Huayra Data, are they making Git changes directly to that repo, or do you have a front end that's where people are actually manipulating, so that way you can have our back on what exactly they can manipulate?
They go through a pull request process that is very similar to the pull request process for making changes to the control repository. We have extensive CICD. I should also add a plug. My teammate Mitch Wright has a talk later today on our testing frameworks. But all of those things are very visible. The exact mechanism for our Huayra Data changes is no one is allowed to push Huayra Data directly. All Huayra Data changes go through the PR process and go through the CI/CD pipeline and are proposed and approved and merged that way. So none of us have the authority to push Huayra Data directly, even on the core team. Yes?
What's your agent to master ratio?
We have 20 compile masters. They're beefy though. 16 vCPUs. Yes?
How often do you run Puppet on each of these nodes?
Our run interval, that is important. I've always wanted to do a really long talk on how to scale really large Puppet infrastructures, but I've always been afraid that I would have maybe 5 people want to see that talk. So, there are, what we do is on a scale that just isn't really in reach for most users, and we get that. Our run interval is currently 4 hours because we're changing around some of the architecture for where things are running. We moved the PuppetDB worker process to Puppet servers. And so we dialed down the run interval a little bit to make it easier to process the size. It's really hard to scale test an environment that big. Our run interval is normally 2 hours though, and that's our target. Yes?
So do you have one repository, or do you have different environments where different repositories for different duty separation?
We have a number of standing environments, and the standing environments represent our promotion process from, here's a great idea for a new piece of Puppet code to different environments through production. And so our expectation is that we have a couple of lower testing environments that people are allowed to push to freely. And then we have, those changes to the modules are then pushed to the master branch of that individual module repository and tagged. And that tag is what then gets promoted from the lower test, the higher testing environments to the production environment. So we're managing somewhere around 250, between 250 260 individual modules. Does that help?
So in the organization I'm in, we have a group of people who are responsible for this set of servers, and they want to keep the fence posts up around those set of servers so that someone outside their team can't make changes to their environment for whatever reason.
Production for us is production.
That was my question.
Yep. We are trying, one of the explicit goals of doing what we're doing with configuration management was to bring together a number of processes that had drifted apart over time. And so the production version of a particular module will have to have the different exceptions for the different kinds of server environments. But we try to leverage the same code base for everything as much as possible. Yes?
Just on the new Puppet developer standpoint, like so you guys said you guys spend a lot of time teaching them Git.
Yep.
What is your overall onboarding that kind of looks, what does it look like? I tried to do some training and teach people Git as a starting point, taught them how to use our test environments and stuff, but then it kind of drops off. So I'm just curious, like, where do you send them, what do you do with them?
Our organization, I think, is somewhat unusual. We have, we do infrastructure configuration management. We have a separate team that is responsible for Git and Git tooling. And that team offers training in Git, which is the basic, how do I check out, how do I branch, how do I push, how do I fork? What we spend most of our time doing with our individual developers is, this is why you branch with this kind of workflow. This is why you fork with this kind of workflow. And so we expect people to kind of understand some of the basics of Git. We spend some time with some of our developers, our new developers, just kind of, getting them used to the command line pieces of it. But most of the time that we spend with them in one-on-one time with Git is more about our workflows and the details of where we branch, where we fork, what we expect the branch names to be, what the different environments mean for different purposes and those kinds of things. We point people at like Udemy courses and things like that for the real basics of command line Git or the usage of VS Code or those kinds of things. But a lot of the time, there's this body of knowledge. The way we think about it is there's this body of knowledge about how Puppet works. There's this body of knowledge about how Git works. And then there's the Walmart-specific way of pushing Puppet stuff into our repository. And we live primarily in that middle space, which, this is how you use Git tooling to reflect the changes that you want to make and, get that stuff into production. In the back.
Thanks, Frank. I work at Deloitte. We're kind of upwards to almost 30,000. You might have to manage 2,000 soon.
Cool.
One of the issues that we're having is different teams only know about their servers. They don't know about other people's servers. So they'll accumulate that. That's like 300. Might manage something that accumulate that owns 10 might manage. So I was wondering how you separate those.
We don't.
Yeah.
The explicit challenge is to bring those environments together as much as possible. And we've been culturally trying to get more leverage out of our sysadmin teams, because what we found was that a lot of the processes and the tooling differed between, for example, what we would call our data center team and our distribution center team, for reasons that were completely non-technical and under investigation, completely nonsensical. Like, here you'd have a mount that would have a different naming convention, and, like all of those things, is it /U, is it /Z, like those kinds of things will drive you crazy across the number of builds that, that we manage, and we saw that. So what we tried to do was to bring all of those different systems processes together and to force people to kind of encounter those differences and to deal with those differences in code. And some of those differences are going away. Some of them are being, enshrined as Huayra Data. We still allow for those kinds of differentiations, but at least everybody's aware of that. And we've got a lot of frontline engineers saying, well, why is that different? Hmm? Yes, Will.
There's been some really good talk about Huayra Data so far, but I wanted to ask, how many layers of Huayra Data do you have on average? And do you have a preference for global, environment, or module data?
Excellent question. The answer is 8. We have exactly 8 layers in global Huayra Data. We added a new one this year, and that was the first. We had 7. We decided to add the 8th. That was kind of momentous. Most of the Huayra Data changes that we do are in global Huayra Data, but we are encouraging our teams. We're kind of in the process of refactoring some of our older code base that we wrote during the Puppet 3 days. to get away from inherits and params.pp and some of those kinds of things. So we're, for situations where our global Huayra data layer does not provide the right structure for what people want to do in their modules, we encourage them to use module level Huayra data. So we have global Huayra data, and that's what we use for most of our changes. We encourage module level Huayra data. We're not using environment Huayra data at this point. Yes?
I think you said you're using over 100 modules. How do you stay out of dependency health with those modules?
We haven't had a huge problem with dependency health for the most part. We try to stick to the most popular modules, the Vox Populi things for the most part, and obviously if there's a supported module, we look for the one that has the highest number of stars and the highest number of downloads. We have not had a huge problem with dependency health. Some of the concat upgrades were a little bumpy, like a year and a half ago. But for the most part, we don't have huge dependency problems. The dependent modules don't rev nearly as often as our internal modules or the wrappers around those modules. And that, because typically the technologies themselves don't change as much, new features don't get added quite as often. Yes?
Do you track Forge modules as they update, or you stick to whatever you get at the time and stay with it over a long period?
Every Forge module is pinned to a specific release. It is very critically important. This is part of objectivity and visibility for us. Every Git SHA of every Puppet file outside of our lowest development environments uniquely identifies a deterministic set of our modules and Forge modules. So every Forge module that gets deployed anywhere always has a version pin, all the time.
What about upgrading? You ever consider upgrading?
Oh yeah, we upgrade everything all the time. We're upgrading standard lib this week. Yep. We upgrade when people need upgrades, typically. Sometimes we'll sweep through and say, hey, it looks like this bunch of modules needs upgrades. And so we'll roll that through our testing environments. Because the Puppet files are applied on a per environment basis, we have a number of standing nodes that we can observe the results of and make sure that they're not causing changes that we don't expect them to, or not having regressions, that we don't have catalog compilation problems and those kinds of things. Yep. Yes, Will?
With an environment as large as yours, it seems like the Puppet console may not provide the high level granularity into what's going on in your environment as you would probably need to keep all of that going. What additional tools do you use to keep track of what's going on in your environment?
That is a fantastic question, and one of the major work streams of the Puppet core team. We supplement the console. First of all, we use console extensively. We love the console, but there are things that we want the console to track that the console isn't currently tracking. And so for those things, we have written a suite of tools that kind of supplements the console. It's a group of tools that we call Puppeteer internally. Creative name, right? Everyone's got a Puppeteer. But Puppeteer will tell us things like what classes are, what modules and what versions are in which Puppet files. We also have a fairly substantial metrics collection mechanism. We've got Grafana and Timescale DB, and we keep track of the different classes, the different kinds or categories of the things that you see on the overview page over time. So we'll track the number of active nodes, the number of inactive nodes, or nodes that didn't make changes, nodes that had resources with errors, nodes that had resources with the catalog that failed to compile the catalog. And we use that as an important operational metric to see, if errors go up, was it because of a deployment? We have integrations that show when our PRs are merged, they will create annotations on a Grafana graph. And so, the annotations API in Grafana is really slick. We've got a guy that did all that stuff. It's beautiful. It really helps things. And we have enough people to be able to apply to those problems. We're trying to drive some improvements in the product as well to make some of those things more generally available. We would rather not do those things, but we do. Yes, Rob?
Your model of circle of trust.
Yes.
You've been talking here since 2015, presumably using Puppet before. When did you start to institute that kind of model? How did you go from whatever you were doing before to that?
From the very beginning. The the circle of, we went from open source Puppet to PE, but the model was always the circle of trust model, that the configuration management team was responsible for tooling, but was not going to be responsible for all the core development. We basically had a couple of people who were delegated to us that were more or less sequestered, and they were kept off pager rotations and all that stuff to write our initial kind of seed code base. And those guys are actually still really high in terms of the overall number of commits. They're still well above me in the top 16 on our leaderboard. But a lot of other people have been able to use all of that code that was generated during that time as templates to be able to do that. But from the very beginning, one of the key cultural things for us was that we as the Puppet team, we were not trying to replace the function of systems administration. We were there to empower the function of systems administration. And the goal is to get the teams that are charged with systems administration and low-level systems management to be able to use better tooling to get their jobs done.